welcome Vrinda Marwah to our seminar. And she is a graduate of the LSC and of the University of Delhi. She has previously worked at Sama and at Kriya, and she's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Sociology. So over to you, Vrinda. We're really looking forward to your talk today. I think it's quite pertinent to it's generally very pertinent, but particularly pertinent to conditions of the pandemic. And we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Prabha. Let me just share my PowerPoint and then get us started. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay, excellent. Yes. So, good morning, everyone. It's 7 a.m. here in Austin, Texas. My name is Prabha. Thank you, everyone, for signing in from your different time zones. Thanks especially to Prabha for having me. I'm going to jump into the presentation because there's a lot to cover, and it would be nice to have some time for discussion later. Okay, so my presentation today is titled Care Work Without Care Workers. It's based on ethnographic research on Asha workers that I've conducted for my doctoral dissertation in sociology. So today's presentation, very broadly, is divided into 4 parts. I will go over the context for this research. So why Ashas, why now? Very quickly, I'll go over the methodology, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later. My findings, this is the bulk of the presentation. And finally, implications for theory and for policy. So first of all, the context. Today, perhaps more than ever before, paid care work is an important arena for research and policy because of social, economic, and demographic changes, including public health environments like the COVID-19 pandemic. Care workers now comprise a growing segment of the global labor force. Care workers, their experiences matter for gender equity. Most of these workers are women, for worker rights, and of course for the quality of care. Community health workers in particular are care workers at the front lines of healthcare provisioning. So who is a community health worker? They're a community member who renders or connects other community members to health services. In recent years, community health worker programs have generated a lot of excitement. These programs are increasingly being looked upon by the international community as a panacea to health workforce shortages. As a result, there's a lot of ongoing discussion in public health circles about the best ways in which we can design, scale up, and sustain community health worker programs, which includes, of course, how best to remunerate workers. And this is where India's Ashas come in. At 1 million, Ashas are the largest all-women community health workforce in the world. They're a relatively new workforce, and they represent a new iteration of paid care work, which I'll get to in a minute. Scholars have noted that in developing countries where issues of worker insecurity are the most glaring, research on paid care work has been the most sparse. And I think Asha's experiences present a privileged vantage point from which we can begin filling these gaps in our understanding. So before we go any further, who are Ashas and what do they do? In 2005, as part of a flagship program called the National Health Mission, the government of India appointed Ashas, or accredited social health activists. Ashas are community women with at least 8 years of education who receive 23 days of initial training and perform 5 key activities. These include home visits, community meetings, health department meetings, outreach services, and maintaining household records. Ashas are appointed across rural India at the ratio of 1 Asha per 1,000 population, and increasingly also in marginalized urban settlements. Mostly, Ashas act as a link between their communities and the government-run health system. Their primary responsibility is to track pregnant women, ensure that they get checkups, medication, and when they're due, they give birth in a hospital instead of at home. Ashas were primarily appointed for the uptake of maternal and child services, but their responsibilities have expanded since then to include TB, malaria, polio, COVID-19, you name it. And this happens because Ashas are the only health system workers who regularly go house to house in their communities. But here's the most important thing you need to know about Ashas. The Indian state categorizes Ashas as incentivized volunteers. So unlike all other health department staff, they are not employees. They are not even contractual employees. In fact, they're not considered workers at all. They are volunteers. but they're remunerated volunteers, and their remuneration takes the form not of a monthly salary, but of task-based incentives. So there's a list of tasks which has grown steadily in number. It started with 5 in 2005, and it's now over 40. Okay, I think these figures really say it all. When I began my fieldwork, I was told that the average Asha in Muxar, which is where I did my fieldwork, makes 2,700 rupees a month. At about the same time, Punjab's Department of Labor issued a circular saying that the monthly minimum wage for a skilled worker is 10,129. Skilled worker is the status category under which Ashas would fall if they were recognized as workers, which they're not at the moment. So effectively, the government is paying Ashas a fourth of what it would owe them if they were workers, right? Okay, and that's not even what this presentation is about. So, this is not a trend that's gone unremarked in the scholarship. Scholars of gender development labor generally comment that this is a part of a global trend of the feminization of obligation. They note that public social services in many countries have come to rely very heavily on voluntary or community work, where the state is essentially sidestepping its own labor regulations by employing women who are not being counted as a part of the labor force. Women are being made, therefore, to work for development rather than development enabling women to secure decent employment. And feminist economist Padmini Swaminathan calls this the formal creation of informality. And what she means by this is there's an informalization of work that's happening with women occupying a more and more central place in this informalization. And it's being achieved through the formal mechanisms of the state. And this is where I'm going to move to my study. So very quickly, I conducted 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork, the summer of 2017, and then from July 2018 to June 2019 on the Asha program. My data collection had 3 components. I did field observations in a rural and an urban block of Muxar district in Punjab. Because Ashas are positioned as a link between community on one hand and the health system on the other, my effort was to follow Ashas as much as possible on both of these ends, right? So I'm observing home visits, community meetings, blah, blah, as well as sort of Asha trainings, health department meetings, patient servicing in hospitals and things like that. Okay, I conducted 20 interviews with experts on the Asha program, and these interviews were at the district level, state and national level. And I interviewed 60 Ashas. And this is the breakdown of the Ashas that I interviewed. These Ashas, so I got a list of all Ashas in the rural and the urban block, and I sampled equal numbers of urban, rural, and Dalit and dominant caste Ashas to interview. These interviews lasted about half an hour to 1.5 hours, and I compensated all Ashas a standardized amount. Okay, my findings. This is my chapterization. I put it out here so people know that what I'm presenting today is from the first chapter, but I don't want to go into a lot of detail because we're short on time. So I can come back to this again if people have questions about the overall research. The argument that I'm trying to make today is this. There's this liminal status that Ashas have been given of incentivized volunteer. And this liminal status creates conditions for chronic underpayment and control of Ashas by the health department. This is today's argument, and I will make it in 3 parts. First, incentives create a mismatch between the work that Ashas do and the pay that they receive. How does this happen? This happens both in how incentives are designed and in how they are implemented. This is a picture from a routine immunization visit that I observed to a government school in a village in Muxar. The Asha is in pink uniform, Jaspreet. She's been a rural Asha for 10 years now. On this particular day, we spent half the day in school with 1st, 5th, and 10th graders, getting them immunized against DPT and TT. Jaspreet had to keep up a very high level of engagement. She was placating and distracting the school children, grabbing and lifting the younger ones. She had to clean up after her 2 nurse supervisors, make sure that all the children were given paracetamols, because when they have pain in the evenings, in the injection site, they will come to her in the village because she lives in the village, right? Everyone else goes home. She's a community member, remember? And this was the second of 3 visits that Jaspreet made to the school in 3 days. So on the previous day, she had to deliver registers from the community health center where the school would record the immunization. And on the next day, she had to make another trip from the health center because the school was out of iron tablets. So the principal asked her to do this. Now, what I want you to note is that none of this work on these 3 days was incentivized. So the metric of a task-based incentive payment, it creates a mismatch between the work that Ashas do and the payments that they receive, because incentives exist for very specific tasks that Ashas perform. But these tasks are the tip of the iceberg of labor that Ashas have to do. So as a result, there's a vast amount of work that they do that remains unpaid. I also discovered that there are several instances in which Ashas do incentivized work, but they're denied payments. So one winter morning, I run into Shinu, who's an urban Asha, at the tea stall at the entrance of the district hospital. After a string of foggy days, it's very sunny and clear, so I tell Shinu, it's such a good day. And this is what Shinu replies with. She says, "What good day? My supervisor has ruined my mood." And I ask her why, so she explains. She struck off an antenatal checkup incentive from my monthly report. The woman had delivered a stillborn child. So the nurse said to me, "What care are we paying you for if the child didn't make it?" Ashas receive their monthly payments based on a monthly report that they file together with their nurse supervisors. Now, the nurse has to sign off on all the tasks completed by the Asha for any given month. And how much the Asha will make for that month in payment is calculated by totaling the incentive for each of those tasks. So only tasks that are validated by the nurse make it to this monthly report. Here, Shinu is upset because her nurse supervisor has struck off a payment that she was expecting. What the nurse has done is that she's pegged the incentive for the patient's antenatal checkup to the birth of a live baby. The nurse has argued that because the baby didn't live, Shinu's care was pointless, and so why should it be remunerated? Now, technically, this is incorrect. Shinu should still be paid for the visits that she made. That's all the incentive was for, the visits, right? But the Asha coordinator at the district level, Sunil, explains to me later that very often nurses are confused about conditions that have to be met in order for incentives to be paid. And according to him, nurses don't have clarity on all incentives. And in department meetings, I myself saw that nurses will routinely ask Sunil to go over this list of Asha incentives with them. And this happens, I mean, it's not always just willful. It happens also because incentives change a lot. So amounts can increase, they can decrease. A task that was incentivized earlier could that was a priority at the district level could become deprioritized. So this is a shifting list. Second, the incentive system gives the health department leverage over Ashas. Navdeep is a rural Asha who's been in the role for more than 10 years now. She's very well connected with other Ashas in the district. And this is rather long, so please bear with me. This is a quote from her interview. So this is me asking Navdeep, do Ashas face problems with nurse supervisors, ANMs, as they're called? Well, yes, there are problems, but I will never tell my nurse that I'm facing a problem with you. Laughs. Even when I'm very upset with her, I'll say, I'm so happy with you. I simply cannot, because she files my monthly report. If I say anything, she will strike off my incentives. She'll probably come up with something. There's a problem here, the date is different there. The 2000 I'm getting now will not even come to 1500. Me. But some Ashas do fight with their nurses. Navdeep. Every time an Asha fights with a nurse, ultimately it's the Asha who has to give in, never the nurse. I've made up my mind about this. I will never fight with my nurse. Because if I do, I will first get told off by her, then I will get told off by the SMO, by the civil surgeon, by everyone. She's going up the health system hierarchy. All the Ashas who fight, they have to finally eat crow. Even if the nurse is at fault, it's the Asha who will lose. Why does this happen, you think? This happens because, see, if Ashas were salaried like the nurse, if we marked attendance like the nurse, then maybe the department would respect us. But they don't consider us equals. They don't consider us a part of the health department like them. They think we're the lowest, the smallest of small fry, you know. No one says to us, come, have a seat. We have to do our work standing. We have to say namaste to them. They think if someone is salaried, that means they are superior. If they are not salaried, they are nothing. Okay, so a few days after this interview with Navdeep, I was able to observe just how the liminal status of Ashas comes into play. I attended a monthly meeting, that's this photograph right here. at the community health center in the rural block of my district. There were about 50 people in attendance, the nurse supervisors and their supervisors. Note that Ashas were not present. The Asha monthly meeting is held separately from the nurses. And I'm going to read out to you now from my field note for this day. Effort to combat maternal mortality under which Ashas were appointed. Today, the health center staff is concerned because the district has seen a rise in mothers delivering in hospitals, but all these mothers are not receiving the JSY cash transfer that's due to them when they deliver in hospitals. This gap is a problem. Why should the number of JSY payments to mother be so low when the number of hospital births is so high? It turns out that mothers must have bank accounts and Aadhaar cards in order to receive the JSY payment. So there's some discussion around how easy or difficult it's for women to get these Aadhaar cards. It seems a lot of women who are eligible for JSY have the address of their natal homes on their Aadhaar cards, which they have to change to the address of their marital homes before they can be paid. The accountant Santosh is speaking. She has ideas about how the JSY gap can be fixed. You have to make sure that you take down all patient details. If you leave any of the columns on the form empty, it's very difficult for us to make the payment. Please take things in writing from patients. If the patient says, I don't have an Aadhaar card, I don't want the payment, take it in writing. That way, at least we'll be able to explain the gap. Also, you tell the Ashas, we will stop your incentive for JSY if you don't close this gap. You tell them this for 1 month and then you see the difference. Look, you are the department. You have to make it run. You have to get strict. This meeting for me epitomizes really the problematic character of the incentive payment format. In function as a lever through which the health department can exert control over. By withholding or threatening to withhold incentives, the department can arm twist Ashas into doing work that's outside of their purview. This is evident from the accountant's solution to the problem of the JSY payment gap. The accountant here is advising supervisors to withhold Asha incentives under JSY for a hospital birth if the mother doesn't receive her JSY incentive. Now, I want you to know the Asha's JSY incentive is completely separate from the mother's. The Asha's JSY incentive is paid to the Asha for persuading women, usually after 9 long months of engagement and care, persuading these women to deliver in government hospitals. So effectively here, the accountant is suggesting it doesn't matter that the work for which the JSY incentive is given to Ashas has been done by the Asha. The accountant is telling the room, you use your ability to withhold this incentive to get the Asha to do the additional and uncompensated work of ensuring that JSY payments are made to mothers. Now, never mind that the reason for this gap could be completely unrelated to the Asha, it could be outside her influence. But during my time in the field, I saw many other examples of this arm twisting. And significantly, the accountant has followed up her advice by telling a room full of supervisors, you are the department, you have to make it run, you have to get strict. So she's implying here very clearly, Ashas are not the department, they are the object of the room's action, the ones with whom the room needs to get strict. And I think this attests to the liminal status that Ashas have been given by the government. It's located inside of the health department, but it really makes them outsiders to the department in a sense. And as volunteers, Asha's claims to incentives are very easily denied using the gendered discourse of service. This is an excerpt from the photograph is unrelated. This photograph is of an Asha training. This excerpt is from a conversation that I have with 3 Ashas, Kamla, Roop, and Japneet. They're all Ashas under the same nurse supervisor. They're in charge of neighboring areas in the city. It was the 27th of August, but their payments for July had not come through. So this is Japneet complaining to me. How are we supposed to run our homes and pay our bills? I am widowed, she points at Kamla. She is fighting a court case against her husband for abandonment. Her husband, nods at Roop, is jobless. They should at least give us some money for transport. When they want work from us, they say, you are staff, you are part of this hospital. If you work well, you will earn all of us a good name. And when it comes to paying us, when we ask about the delays, they say, it's not like your staff. Our work is so hard. We have to run around so much in the heat. It's not easy. But this is how it works here. The highest person has the easiest job. The SMO sits in an air-conditioned room. He just summons people when he needs them and he gets the highest salary. There is no room for us to sit in even. Sometimes when we come with delivery patients, we have to stay the night. We sleep on the floor next to the patient's bed. SMO says, we might not have place for you in the rooms, but there is always place for you in our hearts. Is this correct? Asks Japneet. Now, here Japneet, Kamla, and Roop in this conversation are calling out what they see as the double standards of the health department. There's words of high praise for Ashas, but they find no reflection in the daily practices of the health department. When the SMO tells Kamla there's no space for Ashas in physical rooms, but there's space in their hearts, he's telling her that we might not have physical space to accommodate your physical selves, but there is emotional appreciation of your labor, and that should be enough. The SMO's comment is symptomatic of an imagination of care work as being altruistic in nature and carrying intrinsic rewards, such that other rewards, in this case wages, do not or should not matter. This I found was a recurrent theme. In another interaction, there's a group of 7 urban ashas who bring up their payment delays with the lady health visitor, who's the supervisor of their nurses, so the big boss. And she sort of just says to them, look, you are here to do seva, to do service. And she quotes a common sort of Hindi idiom that they should focus on their work, karm, and not on its fruits, not on the phal, and that God will finally repay them. Most women who work as ashas, it should be noted, can't hold down another job because of the hours and the burden of their work. But the title of a community health volunteer suggests that the work of ashas is something that women can just sort of do by the by, on their own time and on top of whatever else it is that they're doing. And therefore, the income from this work is not imagined to be a household wage or even a living wage. It's imagined to be a form of petty cash, like an honorarium. In sum, what have I argued today? The argument's been in 3 parts. Incentives create a mismatch between the work that ashas do and the pay that they get. For a lot of work that they do, incentives don't exist, and even when they do, they're not always paid. Number 2, the health department can manipulate incentives. They can withhold or threaten to withhold incentives to get ashas to do work that's outside their purview. Third, as women volunteers, Asha's claims regarding incentives are easily dismissible in the everyday life of the health department. Okay. The implications. So, by designing and prioritizing reporting metrics that are very narrowly target focused, states manufacture conditions for unpaid care. For ashas, the metric of task-based incentives renders a lot of their labor that's key to the running of the health department, invisible. And it should be noted that there's no other workforce in the health department that is remunerated in this manner. Incentives apply only to ashas because only ashas have been categorized as volunteers. So here, the Indian state relies on the logic of women's elastic caring, poor women's elastic caring. And elastic caring is sort of the expectation that in their homes, workplaces, and communities, women do and will continue to extend and stretch themselves to provide care. Community health workers live in the communities they serve. They're on call constantly, and their responsibilities, for example, accompanying a pregnant woman to the hospital for her birth, these responsibilities don't allow them to plan their time ahead or take time off very easily. So while it can be argued that women experience the burden of elastic caring in many jobs and indeed in their homes, I would argue that the role of an Asha is practically designed for elastic caring. And now, what kind of employer-employee relationship does this payment system of incentives create? I argue it's a relationship that's infused with fealty. It's almost semi-feudal, almost. Incentives need to be tallied and approved by nurse supervisors every month, and that leaves this metric open to interpretation or discretion. And this discretion then becomes leverage for Asha's superiors to get Ashas to provide ever more elastic care. So the employer in this case is able to make more and more claims on the employee. But what about the employee's claims on the employer? I think Ashas find that their liminal status creates a crisis of credibility for them. So in the everyday life of the health department, Asha's own claims to say a timely payment or to a resting space, These claims are very easily dismissed by staff using the discourse of service, which of course is a gendered discourse. The logic here is that service does not need to be compensated like real work because service is its own reward and service comes so naturally to women. So volunteerism here for the state becomes the perfect alibi. Here, the state is able to idealize the emotional rewards of care and completely neglect structural concerns. And I think most of all, my findings contribute to how we understand the wage for care. Scholars have very long now investigated the wage penalty in care. They've shown how it disproportionately impacts women from marginalized race and class backgrounds, and they've argued that we need to improve measures of care to raise the wages in care. My findings draw attention to an understudied aspect of the not how much is paid, but how the wage is structured as incentives rather than salaries. And I show here that to structure the wage for care as an incentive instead of a salary is much more than simply form. It's much more than a mode of compensation. It's also content. Incentivized pay comes to become a constitutive modality of Asha's work. It becomes a defining feature of their vulnerability because it creates conditions for chronic underpayment and control. And I think that this illuminates how the standard of both wages and working conditions in care is lowered, and how the devaluation of care is being institutionalized in new iterations of paid care work that exist really at the interstices of formal and informal, public and private, temporary and permanent, and work and leisure. Finally, implications for policy. I think given the significant role that community health workers play in the provision of health services, their wages have important practical and policy implications. The World Health Organization has recommended that community health worker programs should be appropriately financed if we want to ensure that services are sustainable, and therefore that community health workers should receive adequate wages. A commensurable salary is the first step towards increasing the motivation of health workers. Certainly, in my study, every Asha sought to be a tenured and salaried employee of the government. I think in the absence of this, we will simply continue, as has been argued by a lot of public health scholars, to rely on individuals from low-income communities to contribute their time, their knowledge, and their skills freely to address health inequalities in society. Thank you. That's the presentation, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Vrinda, for that really, really fascinating paper, which such rich detail from your ethnographic work. It was an absolute treat to hear. So now we are open for questions. Does anyone want to go first? Yeah, go ahead, Nitya.
Thanks, Vrinda. That was a very interesting paper. And I think I just wanted to point out that I think you're absolutely right on this about the institutionalization of unpaid care. But I just had a thought that actually in India, this is not the first, this is not the first time. So for instance, you have, of course, the Anganwadi workers, which are the childcare workers, who started off on a very similar, volunteer basis. And in fact, theirs was, I would say, even worse because they were expected to almost do a whole-time job of childcare, but paid not just paid a lump sum, honorarium it was called, rather than incentive. But your analysis of incentives actually made me think also of the parallel within education. Because for primary education, of course, in India, it has also got what we call as para teachers. Actually, these are highly skilled young men and women from the poor communities, from the local communities, often graduates or postgraduates even, and they are appointed as primary school teachers, but on this kind of volunteer basis with an honorarium. And one of the logics which you didn't talk about, and I was wondering if it applies to the health system, is that in the education department at least, the logic was that people who are salaried, they kind of, there's no accountability, that they kind of take it for granted. They're going to get their monthly salary. As you described, they can sit in their offices. They don't need to step out. Once they've got a salaried job within the government system, then there is no way that, any kind of accountability is not there. So that was the logic that was being provided for keeping these people on so-called contract basis or incentive basis, that this really incentivizes, so you're encouraged to be motivated, you're encouraged to be and so on. So I'm just wondering that whether a similar discourse of accountability is at all apart from this sort of feminization of obligation and the service and the care, which I totally get, because it's a very similar discourse for education as well, that these are youth of the community and they don't have other jobs, and therefore they will provide service towards the younger children, of their own community, etc., etc. So the service discourse, I think, applies across childcare, education, and health. But in the other two, there is a very strong discourse of accountability. And if you get them onto government jobs, then they won't be accountable, and they won't deliver. So I'm just wondering whether there's any of that that also applies to the Ashas. And then I had a second thought, actually, but which maybe I'll just say now so that I don't have to hog it later, is about the unionization. That, of course, within Anganwadis, these have been volunteers, and also the para teachers now in Bihar, Jharkhand, where I work, that they have unionized, saying that, we're doing too much work. And the only way is collective action, which is, of course, a feminist strategy as well, in order to demand. They're not always successful, but they have unionized in order to demand a better recognition and better wages.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nitya, for those questions. It's such a pleasure to speak to an audience that knows India. I don't always get that, here in Texas. I kind of have to always begin at the beginning. Where is Punjab? That's always my first line. So this is really a treat for me, I have to say. I completely, you've made extremely pertinent points. I think that the logic that you're talking about with Anganwadis and para teachers is exactly the logic that they have applied to Ashas. So there's a review paper by Rajni Ved and others that looks at how policymakers respond. The policymakers who've been key to instituting and sort of scaling up this Asha program, what their take is now on the way it's running, and you'll see the same discourse, the same idea that for some of them, that Ashas were never meant to be the last person, the last bureaucrat of the health department. They were meant to sort of be activists. They were meant to be these community members who are really doing this for civic engagement, to keep the state accountable, all of that. So they weren't meant to be salaried. You will certainly hear this logic that people who are salaried don't work, right? It's hard to keep them accountable. It's especially hard because Ashas have been given rural areas, first of all, and you don't always have the infrastructure, the personnel who can monitor the way a person is working in rural areas. To me, this, and actually you'll see that this discourse makes it makes some sense when you consider that health is a state subject. So the National Health Mission it's been sort of renewed periodically, but it began really in mission mode. The idea was that this is the central government is coming in to do this, and then finally, states will take it up, and states will, have more and more of their own budget and their own. And as we all know, in India, the governance levels of governance vary so widely between states that how the Asha program is run depends to a very large extent on how governance in general is run in that state. But I must object, because I don't find that this logic of, let's not take salaries, let's all be on incentives because we'll be better workers, that always seems to apply very selectively. All of these policymakers and sort of officers of the government who have this grand suggestion for efficiency for Ashas, they never seem to apply it to themselves and say, oh, let's all give up our salaries, let's all be incentivized because it makes us so much better as workers. I also want to say there is no, as a sociologist, a lot of people told me, why don't you do a comparison? I wish I could have done a comparison with a male health workforce, but it doesn't exist. That's all voluntary. I can tell you what does exist: a community interface of male workers called male multi-purpose health workers. That does exist, and they're in charge of vector-borne diseases, like malaria and all. And let me tell you, they're tenured and salaried. So that exists, and I think that what that shows you is that Asha's precarity, this liminal status, it has very little to do with their low ranking in an occupational hierarchy. And it has everything to do with their gender. Because what I'm telling you is that a workforce of men who are interfacing directly with the community, right, with rural communities, it exists in the health system, but it's tenured, it's salaried, it's higher skilled, and it's not like the Asha workforce at all. So I think that there's this, I think that this logic of kind of, if accountability is the problem, you need better structures of accountability, right? But this kind of, this saying that, we're not giving them salaries because we're trying to keep them, on their toes, I find it's a classist and a sort of extremely sexist discourse, definitely in the health department. And you're absolutely right. Actually, Ashas look to Anganwadi workers, I mean, Anganwadis are also much older workforce. So actually, Ashas looked to Anganwadi workers, and a lot of them took on this job because they thought it would become a sarkari naukri, a government job. They when the role was first announced, they kind of, a lot of them were attracted to it because there was this promise, that the state would eventually down the line slowly, convert them into a permanent workforce, or at least into a salaried workforce, even if not a permanent one. Neither of those has happened. But sadly, and this is something I explore in another chapter, the state does hold this kind of this promise, so workers continue to be attached to it. The second thing that you said about unionization, yeah, Ashas have massive unions, in some cases tremendously successful unions. The Haryana Asha Union has been successful in organizing like a 100% strike for days on end till they received what was like, it's not exactly a salary, but it functions like a salary because the Asha payment there's a fixed honorarium, and then there's an incentive on top of that. Even the fixed honorarium is against certain tasks, but it functions as a monthly sort of payment. So what they were able to do is they were able to bargain for that fixed portion of their salary to be increased and for incentives to be increased. So now Haryana Ashas are getting close to 8,000 rupees a month. But Punjab is not there yet. Punjab has multiple unions, but they simply haven't been able to work with the same kind of unity and kind of bring the government to its knees the way the Haryana Ashas have done. So there's definitely unionization, but as you said, it's not always successful, and a lot has to do, I think, with local, state level sort of factors. Thank you so much for this question.
I think Shireen had her hand up earlier, and then Christopher. Shireen, do you want to?
Prabha, thanks. Vrinda, I was just writing something because Nitya asked the two questions I wanted to ask. So that's why I put two. Thanks.
Great. Christopher? Can't hear you, Shalini.
Sorry, Prabha, it's me. Christopher's my son, and he's been doing online homework on Microsoft Teams the whole day, so his name is coming up. So sorry, Vrinda, thank you so much. That was just such a rich and enjoyable talk. Actually, I just have a comment more than a question. I find the way you have mapped the devaluation of care to be very interesting. And I just want to draw a parallel with that in my own work, which is on expatriates in India as employers of domestic and care workers, and how, these care workers have such a sophisticated skill set and what they are paid. And I just, there is such a sort of a moral universe around justifying thinking and creating this rhetoric that these are really high salaries when they're not. Because when you look at the skill set, how much you'd be paying for that fantastic cook in France or the US, and what you get away with. So I just think it's really important, like you're saying, to point out this chronic sort of underpayment, which I see in a niche labor market that comes under formalized practices, because you have reference letters, you have employment contracts, but the way they have justified low pay is something that I've been writing about for a long time now. So yeah, it's more a comment, but thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Shalini. I do completely agree. I think there's been a lot of feminist work. I mean, I'm sure including yours, that looks at how skills that are required for certain forms of work are some skills are valued higher than others. There's a masculinization of skill sets. So skill sets that are socially masculine or whatever are the ones that tend to get remunerated or whatever, higher status and all of that. Again, I didn't have time to really go through my chapterization, but in one of my chapters where I sort of follow Ashas into their communities, I talk about this, and I talk about it as motivational labor, because what the Asha is doing is she has to build. It's intimate labor, really. She has to build intimate relations with women in her community, who will then entrust her with information about their health, about their family's health. They'll accompany her to the hospital, which is a big deal for a family to allow, their daughter-in-law to go off, with a woman they don't know that well for the whole day to the hospital, right? Like it takes a lot of trust, and I look at how Ashas build that trust, and a lot of it is through sort of talking, commiserating, following up with people, keeping up this kind of the ability to motivate a household to accompany you to a government service is not a small task. It's actually an extremely tedious task, and it takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of discretion. It takes tact. It takes but again, these are not skills that, as you say, are valued. In fact, what I heard again and again in the health department was that, I mean, what is the big deal? Women gossip. They go to house and they talk. This is just what women do. So even when they use the same word, right, when they say motivate, they don't mean it in the same with the same sort of valence. They mean it in a very sort of this is just women's natural kind of ability. It's not something we need to take seriously. Whereas what I found was that Ashas were doing, it was very serious work, and it was rebranding. They were really rebranding the state, because the idea of a government hospital, still in a lot of people's minds, it's a death trap, and they have to kind of convince these families that that's not how it is anymore. And they need to trust their Asha and come along with her, even if it's just for one day, check it out for themselves. What the work that she's doing is at sort of multiple levels, but the recognition, as you say, of that work is it simply doesn't exist.
Great, thank you. Anne?
Thank you. I think it's more of a comment than a question, but picking up on what Nitya said, I was thinking about the earlier legal interventions around satins and rural workers, and which led in the end to court challenges and sexual harassment laws. And so how I was always fascinated in the development of that litigation, that sort of public interest litigation. I'm from a legal background. How that turned from being women working in the community to being employees in some sense, as being able to experience sexual harassment. So somehow by moving it into the realm of the law, their status in a way was changed in that way. So I suppose the question is, I'm fascinated by how they're positioned, because it seems to me it says a lot about the nature and the evolution of the state and what constitutes the provision of state services. And I think we've seen that all over the world, whereby the state increasingly contracts out, privatizes, works in conjunction, incorporates NGOs to do the delivery, and so on. So I think it's really interesting to see the way in which to what extent it reflects wider on the way we understand the state. But also, I think I'm just fascinated by the way in which they are positioned to be constructed as this type of worker rather than another type of worker, somehow, and again, whether any sort of legal challenge in that sense by moving into a different framework. All right, organisation and collective action through unionization is one way of gaining status, but another might be through some redefining of their status as workers, really, through those positions. So I think it's just more a comment, but a question about, have you thought about how that might work, or whether there have been any challenges?
Yeah, that's a great comment, actually. And it's something for me to think about, because I position my work really at the sort of intersection of gender and political sociology. My primary interest is really in how states reproduce and sort of maintain legitimacy and that sort of a thing. Like I was saying, I think one way in which the state has been able to not face up to its legal obligations is exactly by not giving them the status of worker, right? They're not workers, hence, work-related regulations don't apply. That's been one thing. But the state does have to comply with a lot of other rules that are in its system. So, for example, what I saw in my field was that if an Asha, say a village has 2,500 people, and there are two Ashas servicing that village, right? If, as a favor to somebody, the superiors and the health department appoint a third Asha in that village. So now it's 3 Ashas for 2,500 people. What it means for those Ashas is that their monthly payments will go down, because they all get a smaller chunk of the population to service, right? So the other 2 Ashas will challenge that third Asha's appointment, because it says in the government's rules that you have to have a minimum of 1,000 people per Asha. Otherwise, the Asha earns nothing. Everything is based on cases that she brings in, right? So if there are 10 deliveries, between 3 people, that doesn't come to very much in the year. So what I definitely saw Ashas do was that they would use every available unionization is one. These kinds of challenges to, let's say, Asha rules, right? Not their rights as workers, but the rules around the Asha program. They will use everything that's at their disposal. I don't know about national cases. I was kind of I tended to be very focused on my field. But I wonder, actually, that's a great question. Maybe I should look that up. I don't know if there have been any sort of big national level court cases, but this was at least how I saw in my field. Ashas use the law, but I have to say, there's the private sector has been so unreliable, so much more precarious, so much more, I think, in many other ways exploitative, that Ashas continue to be in the sway of the state. There's the idea that, and I mean, the term I use for it from Bourdieu is like promissory capital. The state has many kinds of capitals. It concentrates many kinds of capitals, but particularly in a market like India's, it's just the promise that one day, these struggles will translate into is enough to have people sort of throw in their lot, hold it out, and say that, and as Nitya said, look at Anganwadis, they have a salary now. Look at, there's this kind of, so I mean, when the Anganwadi program was started, we were looking at a very different state and a very different economy. But these workforces, they also keep giving hope, and the state keeps giving hope. The state will do these. When I was in the field on Diwali, Modi announced a Diwali gift for Ashas, and the Diwali gift was a doubling of their incentives that come from the central government. So what was 1,000 rupees became 2,000 rupees, And one of the things I argue is that these overtures, they help to keep Ashas in this sway of the state, right? Because they're constantly showing them that, look, the state cares. The state it's sort of, throwing them these kind of piecemeal gifts, and that the hope is, okay, one day the big ask, which is of stable employment, that one day maybe they'll throw that our way as well, right? So
wonderful, thank you so much, Parvati.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really sorry to have joined very late, but I just got the sort of last bit of your paper and the presentation and the questions and answers. So, but I read the outline of your presentation first earlier in the morning. So apologies first for joining late. Second thing to say is that it also really is interesting to think about this in the context of what's happening more globally in terms of the extent to which there are similar but slightly different formations of the entrepreneurial and fragmented versions of care activities, which draw upon both some element of cultural embodied knowledges, which can be traded, but may also, which is not necessarily seen as being part of the kind of exchange economy, and therefore is available for a gift economy, right? So there is something here about its general circulation of certain kinds of activities within certain versions of the gift, and a feminized gift. It is a gift of femininity and a gift by women, for women very often, or to support women. But it is also working within a particular version of capitalism, where this is. So I did an interview with somebody who does some cultural translation work, cultural mediation work in Germany. And so not translation, but mediation. So if they were a translator, they would be seen as professional. But if they're a mediator, then it's their cultural knowledge which enables them to do. But of course, language and translation is hugely part of it. But I think you could see parts of the same thing about the entrepreneurial self, about having to, and so on and so forth, and the working conditions. So, but equally from your paper, what I also see is the really big differences where there is a promissory state, which I think is, which is really different. So it would be very good at some point to see from you a kind of a longer version of this with its, putting this in the context of global forces, but also then really looking at what's different about India.
Parvati, thank you so much for that comment. Actually, now I really wish I had gone over my chapterization because, like I was saying, these findings are really from the first chapter where I look at how Ashas are positioned in the state. Then I sort of follow Ashas into their communities, and I finally really the dissertation is about both the status quo, like what it means for Ashas to be stuck in this position with the state, but also how they're making use of this position. And that's where your comment on the gift really strikes me as extremely insightful, because what I find is that, like I was saying, Ashas do all this intimate work of building trust and relationships with households. And that work is not without its rewards. And what basically happens is that as an Asha, if I am close to Prabha's family, and I know all about what's bothering Prabha, and what health issues Prabha and her family has, then what I can do is, that knowledge is a source of power for me. What I can do is I can advise Prabha to go to maybe this private clinic or that private clinic, for the heart surgery that someone needs. Or so I can use my knowledge to generate commissions from private clinics. I can use it to do any manner of even you'd be surprised, something like, Prabha wants to buy an expensive phone, right? But she can only afford it on installments. I will serve as her guarantor in the local mobile shop. Get creative about the way in which they've been positioned, But there are real limits to that, to how much they can really accrue for themselves. But what definitely happens is that they get a lot of blame. You'll see this if you follow the news on Asha, you'll sort of see this again and again. Senior doctors in government services, senior government officers are always blaming Ashas for sort of leeching off of the government system and redirecting people to these sort of greedy, unscrupulous, private players. When actually, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen at all, but there is private sector capture of the Indian public health system at so many levels that goes unremarked. But you've put these women in a position of having such little to go on, and then when they get creative, with their role, they become the fall guys, for the privatization of the Indian public health system in these big and small ways. So actually, this your comment, I don't know if you, even though it was you came late. Actually, it gets to the heart of something in my dissertation, which is that why Ashas do this work and how they do it.
So can I just ask a quick follow-up question, Vrinda? I was also very curious about what the social status of these workers were in the community, because obviously, just by shifting the legal status or giving someone a salary doesn't necessarily mean that that work is not, has social value. But I was also curious about what the age profile of these women was, clearly because this seems to be very demanding physical labor, and it also sits, I suppose, with other sort of reproductive commitments they have to their own families. So I just wondered whether this was like in many other sectors where women predominate, time-bound kind of occupation, and if so, what they do later on. This kind of advising people in the community also requires a certain, you're a particular age, therefore then you get taken more seriously. So I was just curious about the profile of these workers.
So one of the rules of the Asha program is that the Asha should be married, and she should be because the logic is that if she's unmarried, then when she gets married, she'll leave the community and go off to her husband's village or whatever. So they lose that community member. In my fieldwork, most of the Ashas were in their late 30s, mid to late 30s, I would say. A lot of them have the rural workforce, especially, which is larger in number, has been around for like more than 10 years, since about 2007-8. So there have been people who've been doing this since they were in their mid 20s. I think your point is actually, it's a very interesting one with regards to social status, because there is this. I think it's considered. I found a lot of caste differences. Sort of, they come into play in many aspects of the Asha's work, but certainly in this one, which is that at least in Punjab, in Muxar district where I was doing field work, there tended to be many more. Muxar generally has one of the highest percentages of Dalits in the population. It's as high as 42% of the population is Dalit. So therefore, I mean, most Ashas are also Dalit, which is not surprising, because the one of the efforts of the Asha program is to match the women to the community that they're serving. So most of my respondents were Dalit or OBC. There tended to be fewer general category Ashas. The general category Ashas were usually poorer than their other general category counterparts. So it's not, the upper castes don't see it really as respectable work, because you're going house to house. You have to be out at odd hours. Sometimes a delivery can take 2 nights. And if you've come from a village to the district hospital, it means you've spent 2 nights, 3 nights in the district hospital without returning home necessarily, right? Because you're accompanying the family. So it's for all of those reasons, it's considered, borderline licentious and all of that. So it's, whereas I think that there was more to be gained in the job by lower caste women, but also because lower caste public service than upper caste communities. So a lot of general category people opt out of public health services. They go into private services. So for a lower caste Asha to motivate an upper caste household, it's almost impossible. But for a lower caste Asha or an upper caste Asha to motivate a lower caste household, that's really where you can, the more cases you get there, that's where the bulk of your incentive income is sort of going to come from. And those are also communities that most need and want to sort of be joined with the state, to be part of welfare schemes, to figure out how, a lot of other programs of the government are working. How do you get your Aadhaar card made? All these sorts of all these manners of opting in to the state. Those are the communities that most want it and need it. So a lot of the status gains, I think, accrue in that caste for that reason, in lower caste ashas. So, I mean, again, I don't go into caste in this presentation as much because I'm really talking about an occupational status. But caste becomes a big part of how ashas operate and how they sort of succeed. And this is one way in which it happens. So to answer your question, I would just to say that it varies by caste, but that gains usually accrue for lower caste ashas much more for all of these reasons.
Okay, terrific. So I think we're just reaching time. Unless anyone else has any questions, I'd like to thank you very, very much for a truly inspirational talk and a great kickoff for our monthly seminar series. And definitely, I hope we can stay in touch, certainly on the legal aspect of it, because that is something definitely that we can pursue further. Because just listening to your presentations, there were at least 2-3 areas where I thought, wow, that sounds like it violates the Indian Constitution. So I'm sure there are many lawyers also who would be keen to use this kind of social scientific evidence that you're generating to inform their cases and their litigation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Huge thanks. Wonderful stuff. Bye.
Thank you.